Hi, you're watching Hindustan Times. I'm Aditi Prasad, and today with me are Sukumar Ranganathan, the editor-in-chief of Hindustan Times, and of course Roshan Kishore, Hindustan Times political data and political economy editor. And we are going to be decoding Budget 2023 for you. A few hours ago, Nirmala Sitharaman delivered her fifth consecutive budget speech to the nation, and a budget for Amrit Kal. She said that several times during her speech for the India at 100, clearly meaning that a budget for growth. In sharp contrast to obviously many people ahead of this budget calling it a budget for Mission 2024 because everybody was predicting that since this is the last full budget of the Modi government, there are going to be lots of sops for the middle classes, for the vulnerable, so that they are able to sort of get their ducks in a row ahead of Mission 2024, ahead of the 2024 general elections. But I want to come to you, Sukumar, because we want to decode this budget for our viewers. A lot of things are being said. Those are that the government is saying something great, great budget. The opposition parties are saying something else. They obviously tearing apart the budget and all the proposals in every direction. But a sense from you, what is this budget all about? Is it a budget for growth for India at 100, or is it a budget for Mission 2024, or is it a mix, a very good, in fact, mix of both?
See, I think it's an interesting budget because it's not as populist as many people expected it to be. There are definitely some populist measures, but these are not populist measures that have sort of bet the house. So if you look at some of the big takeaways from this budget, they would be the fact that India continues to invest a huge sum of money in capital expenditure, infrastructure, and this is good. This is productive investment. You're not using your investment for anything else. This year's investment is 33% higher than last year's investment, budget estimate to budget estimate. And I think even the revised estimates last year, we spent a little less, and not hugely less, a little less than what we expected to spend on capital expenditure. So I think that is a good move. It's a record amount of 10 lakh crore that the government plans to spend in 23-24. The second thing is there are these marginal tax changes. I'm not sure the material impact of this is going to be huge, but the sentimental impact of this, I think, is going to be significant, could help the cost of consumption. And they focused on important things, which typically budgets don't look at. Looked at the climate crisis, which is actually not the future, it's the here and now. So there's a significant spend of 35,000 crores on energy transition, for instance, which has been announced in the budget. Looked at things like 5G and developing apps for 5G, looked at things like artificial intelligence, looked at a new data framework. So these are all forward-looking announcements, and some of these announcements are actually backed by money. So I think we would be doing this budget an injustice by saying that it is just focused on 2024. It doesn't hurt the BJP's cause for 2024 in any significant way, but I definitely think it's a forward-looking budget. And most importantly, lest I forget, it's a budget that also prioritizes macroeconomic stability, because the fiscal deficit has been brought down from 6.4% last year to 5.9% in 23, 6.4% this year to 5.9% in 23-24. Which again shows that the government's priorities are, it's not sacrificed its macroeconomic priorities at the altar of elections.
Oh, the government has said that they will spend a record, 33% more, 10 lakh crore rupees on long-term capital expenditure. Now, this is obviously an extension of its strategy to revive growth after COVID. this is quite a significant sum. And, given that there is pressure on revenues, because a lot of people are asking, where is this money going to come from? They have cut down on various welfare schemes, but they are going ahead full steam, and they've shown their intention that they don't have any intention of backing off as far as this is concerned. Do you see this push by the government to on capital expenditure to translate or sort of egg the private sector also to sort of fuel that sort of investment into the sector, given that they've been very, very sluggish as far as expenditure has been concerned over the last couple of years?
I think Roshan should answer this question.
Roshan, yeah, please.
Well, the fact that the government has continued to prioritize capex, I think more than anything else, it tells you that this is not a government which is politically insecure about its future prospects.
Hmm.
By definition, if you're putting money in capex today, it is not going to, like, its results are not going to show even 1 or 2 years down the line. For example, all of us know that the Golden Quadrilateral project, which the Atal Bihari Vajpayee government invested in, it lost the 2004 elections, but the economic benefits of that project and the kind of infrastructure overall it sort of triggered in the economy were realized by later governments. So this government perhaps thinks that it is not going out of power anytime soon, and which is why it is going on investing the way it is. The other question about private capital not sort of playing its part in boosting investment spending is a very valid question. The economic survey, the chief economic advisor actually made that noise that they signaled that they're not happy with private capital at all. But Aditi, the catch is that the private capital will only invest when it sees future profits on its own investments. And whereas the government might like to claim that the Indian economy's prospects are going to be very good, say 10 years down the line or 25 years down the line, as the government's claim seems to be. If private capital doesn't feel certain about its future prospects, then it will perhaps not spend. We will have to see, because a lot of consumption demand which we saw last year was essentially of a pent up variety. A lot of people could not travel, so once the pandemic got over, they started traveling. A lot of people, once the threat of layoffs and all that, although a fresh round is now started, and I'm sure there will be some impact in India also on consumer sentiment, especially in the tech sectors and all that. How these factors sort of culminate into overall spending behavior, like Sukumar said, the government has done some like tax tweaks to sort of encourage spending. Private capital spending decisions will, I think, will be driven more by these decisions than what the government wants it to do. So and the culmination of all of these factors, I think, and the results of the Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh election cycle, which is when the government will see how vulnerable or not vulnerable the BJP is to these pressures. I think they will be seen in the next like vote on account or the interim budget when it is presented next year. But by now, this is what the government is planning to do, and if we know this government in the last 8 years, what it plans to do, it ends up doing.
It ends up doing. But let's talk about the revenues bit. You said yourself that there's this pent up demand, and even I was speaking to a couple of analysts, experts earlier. They were talking about how the money that how the revenue that this government is banking on, largely GST collections are up, tax collections are up, but they're saying that they that may not, given the global headwinds, they may not be as robust in this financial year, but yet there is a lot of expenditure laid out. And as far as disinvestment is concerned, that's one area. When I'm talking about revenues, that's one area where this government hasn't really done that well, except for the Air India disinvestment, perhaps. Could you talk about where the money is going to come from? And I'd like to go to Sukumar with that question. Sukumar?
See, I think you just need to look at one particular aspect when it comes to revenues, right? I mean, sure, there are some amount that's being put in disinvestment revenues, and questions can be asked about how effectively you can go ahead with a disinvestment in a year ahead of an election and things like that. But if you were to look
Right.
at tax revenue, which is the largest component of this, and the assumption for tax revenue, part of it is, you can call it conservative because it is reasonable or plausible. Let's not call it conservative, let's call it plausible or reasonable. because they've assumed a 10.5% nominal growth, which is a reasonable assumption. The one assumption that people can quibble about is the buoyancy aspect of it, right? I mean, they've expected a tax buoyancy of almost 1, right, Roshan? I mean, last year
Yes, exactly.
it was
Yeah.
8, now it's to like, it's 1, which effectively means that for every unit growth in GDP, your tax also grows by the same amount. That's basically shorn of everything else. That's really what tax buoyancy means, which means your tax collections become more efficient. On what are they basing this? Probably because some of the indications from GST are that compliance has improved, the base has widened, and maybe they feel confident enough to make that assumption. So I don't think it's an aggressive assumption. That's where the revenue is going to come from, and of course some of the revenue is going to come from borrowings, right? I mean that's the reason why we have a fiscal deficit, and 5.9% is in the current context, because we are still 5.9% would have been a horrible number if the pandemic had not happened, right? I mean, we would have been in violation of our own Fiscal Responsibility and Budgetary Management Act and the commitments that the government has made under that. But the pandemic threw everything out of kilter. So if you look at fiscal deficit of countries around the world, they've all soared out of control. And here, the government is pulling back the fiscal deficit from 6.4% to 5.9%, which I think is creditable. So I don't think this question of will they have the money to fund, or where is the money going to come from, is as pressing as it might have otherwise been, because it is fairly transparent where the money is going to come from.
All right.
Roshan, you want to add to that?
Roshan.
No, like Sukumar said, there are only two questions here. If you look at the plain arithmetic of it, it doesn't seem very aggressive, except for perhaps the tax buoyancy part. But there are only two things which are worth sort of flagging here. One is, that actually, 22-23 post-pandemic corporate profits sort of actually, grew at a very fast rate. Now that inflation is coming in and perhaps demand will slow down, will corporate taxes, continue to show the same kind of growth? I think, this is a question worth asking, even though one should not be necessarily skeptical. The other thing is, that the government has clearly made, gains as far as compliance in the GST regime is concerned. Now, were those gains one-off, or will those gains continue to sort of, give a boost to GST revenue? Something we need to watch out for. But, other than that, I think like the crux of the revenue estimates is in the nominal GDP, where the government has been slightly, if not very conservative this time as well. And this is what this government has been doing. It basically shows some sort of optimism in its revenue estimations, but it shows an inherent degree of conservatism in its GDP growth estimations, and the two eventually balance out. This is how it has been playing out for the last couple of years, I would say.
Under promise and over deliver, is that what you are getting
to? Yes.
All right. I just wanted to, Roshan, maybe taking forward from that, because that is ahead of this budget, unemployment and inflation were the two things that were everybody was talking about. That how will this budget address unemployment, the rising unemployment, the rising inflation, the price rise? So for the middle class, for the salaried class, there seems to be some sort of cheer. Can you just, if possible, explain the tax changes to our viewers so that they sort of understand it, because this is new tax regime and old tax regime, and which one to go for? I mean, everybody can use a tax calculator, which probably will be available online. But if you could just make our viewers understand what it means for them. Does it leave more money in their pocket? What does it broadly mean, the new tax structure?
I am anything but a personal finance or a tax expert, but let me try and explain this as best as I can. For a lot of income tax payers, of my generation and earlier generations, the first thing you would do after perhaps, getting a job is you would go and buy an LIC policy. A lot of middle class families in India would usually buy a home because they would see, that 3.5 lakh sort of income tax deduction from the taxable incomes. The government now thinks, I think, that, it should nudge people to let go of those exemptions and pay less in taxes, but hopefully spend the rest of the money which they're not paying in taxes in the economy, thereby giving a boost to consumption and eventually growth. This is what the crux of the new tax regime is, which was announced in 2020. This time, the finance minister has made further exemptions to that, and there's perhaps reason to believe that eventually the old tax regime will be discarded. So this is more a feel good, like Sukumar said, sort of a indicator rather than a very tangible indicator of how much boost to consumption or tax savings will happen. The finance minister said in his speech that the income tax announcements which he's making will lead to a revenue forgone of 35,000 crore rupees, which is not a very significant amount, but it will basically encourage more and more people to sort of adopt the new tax regime. And here too, I think, like the capex focus of the government, the game is a slightly long term one, where they hope that people will actually spend more and more of their like incomes rather than like going for what I would describe as forced savings in the Indian environment.
It's
Right.
also,
Sukumar,
if
just a
I,
related question. Yeah,
sorry,
please.
if I may add, I think whether your question was, should you go for this or should you not go for that? And I think the simple answer is it depends on where you are in your earning and your investment cycle. And I think what the new tax regime um, fundamentally assumes, and it's a correct assumption, is that there is a certain generation of gig workers and other people who do not really get the kind of social benefits that others do, and for whom the new tax regime might actually be a far more efficient um, taxation regime to work under or to pay taxes under. It will increase the amount of money that they have. At the same time, there are people who are probably in their 40s and their 50s who bought a house in the first wave or the second wave of the huge house buying thing that India saw, and have probably paid off their EMIs. And for them, the housing benefit perhaps does not make sense, and you move them also to that, so perhaps it makes sense for them also. So I think whether or not you move to the new tax regime to take advantage of some of the things that the finance minister announced today, it's going to be a function of where you are in that cycle. Will it help some people? Of course it will.
All right. Just a related question. A few years ago, corporate tax, was slashed by the finance minister Sitharaman, and that sort of increased the compliance levels. Do you believe that this new tax regime announced today, and if more and more people opt for it, do you think that evasion will go down and compliance will go up, and hence there might be an uptick in tax revenues for the government, or is it too insignificant a number to talk about it?
I'm not sure where that data is coming from. I'm not sure there is anything to show that there is a correlation between the lower tax rate. I mean, theoretically, yes, but the specific example that you give of a lower corporate tax rate and higher compliance. Roshan, have you seen anything to suggest that that happened?
The logic is different. The Lafaka logic is different. That if you reduce tax rates, then basically incomes go up and overall tax collections rise. I don't think it's got anything to do with compliance.
No, sorry, the tax, the collections went up. Sorry, compliance
Yeah.
was the wrong word. The collections went up.
Yeah,
No, see, the way to look at it, yeah, is that tax collections as the size of the economy increases will eventually go up. I mean, unless tax rates have been really slashed, which is more the case in economies like the United States and all that. It's very difficult to sort of socially sell a drastic reduction. Although the 2019 reduction was drastic in many ways, but it's very difficult to sell those reductions in an economy like India. So I think the government is of course hoping that if more people save in taxes and spend in the economy, and then eventually the size of the economy grows and tax collections grow up. So this is a part of the larger macroeconomic bet, as I put it.
And
Okay, in terms of mission,
also
sorry,
important
yes.
to acknowledge that the 2019 cut, one of the motivations for that was to make Indian industry, Indian manufacturing competitive in a global context. And given something that you're continuing to see in this budget, which is the focus on ease of doing business and boosting local manufacturing in India. For instance, there have been some measures done in the area of which makes electronic manufacturing in India more competitive, even in this budget. I think that was one of the motivations for the changes that happened in tax in 2019.
Right. Just want to also talk about, because we talked about the inflation and we talked about the the tax rates and therefore more money in the hands of people perhaps and to boost spending. The other big issue was ahead of the elections was unemployment, how and job creations. How does this budget, according to you, Sukumar, uh, given the emphasis on unity malls to roads and highways to housing, do you believe that this is a budget that can go on to create jobs and can, and at least to the extent that quarters?
The best person to answer any question on jobs is Roshan. So I'd like Roshan to make a crack at this.
Okay, Roshan,
There,
this one
there,
is over to
there are two
you.
ways to look at it. As far as unemployment numbers are concerned, like the survey also yesterday pointed out, those numbers
Yeah.
have actually been coming down. And if you look at urban, because we really don't have the rural unemployment numbers, but our unemployment numbers have come down significantly compared to what they were during the pandemic. But in an economy like India, I don't think unemployment numbers capture the severity of the employment crisis, because the challenge is
Crisis.
not to like just land a job, but land a job which is well paying, which sort of allows you to have a decent standard of living. There, the basic challenge is to move more and more people out of agriculture to industry. There, the basic challenge is to move more and more people into secured, like remunerative forms of employment, rather than like somebody going and setting up basically like a shop outside on the road, etc. I think there the government's narrative, as it would like us to believe, is that it wants to formalize more and more of the rural economy. There was a lot of talk about boosting the cooperative ministry in this sales budget. They hope that this will like boost a lot of things from artisanal products to sugarcane to all kinds of things. So they are hoping that gradually more and more parts of the economy will come into the formal sector, and that will sort of improve the quality of earning and jobs in the economy. Uh, it clearly does not see the need to support what I would describe as really a crisis-driven employment creation, which is evident in the fact that the NRGS allocation has been cut. So once again, whether this plan works or not, we will have to wait and see, because this year, the pent up demand is over now. Although we have no pandemic, etc. So we'll have to like give it some time to see how the government sort of calculations on this front materialize. But like I said, in India, the key is to always take the official unemployment numbers with a pinch of salt, because the challenge is more qualitative than quantitative in nature.
All right, I'm going to sum up this conversation probably with a question to you, Sukumar, and that's about the global headwinds and their impact on the budget. Last year also a budget was presented, but all the calculations went for a toss when Russia went ahead and invaded Ukraine, and all the numbers went topsy turvy. This time around, again, we have a global recession looming. There are global headwinds. We also know, and you've spoken about it many times, the tailwinds that India has, and that there are tailwinds too. India has been performing reasonably better than many of the developed countries on many parameters as far as the economy is concerned. How do you see? This coming financial year playing out? According to as far as the budget is concerned, there is a plan, there is an economic survey. How do you see the next 1 year playing out, given the global headwinds and the tailwinds that are with India?
If I knew the answer, I think I would be sitting somewhere else. But
True.
because there were so many exogenous shocks that the economy experienced. Because the last year when the budget was presented, no one thought that Russia and Ukraine would go to war. I mean, it's easy to say in hindsight that this was coming, but back then we didn't expect a commodity price shock. We didn't expect a concerted action by central banks around the world to hike interest rates. I mean,
High
with this
rates.
kind of, they've never acted. I mean, this level of concerted action was unprecedented. So very difficult to say. But I think in many ways, and I hope I'm not wrong, and I hope I'm not jinxing it, I think the worst is over even for the world. And I'm basing this purely on the fact that the IMF report seems to suggest that the latest IMF economic outlook report seems to suggest that things are getting marginally better, right? I mean, not hugely better, but marginally better. And maybe the recession will not be as significant as in the countries that see it, in the countries that see it this year, as it was initially expected to be. But too soon to say. I mean, there are far too many factors at play here. and we all saw what happened to China, right? I mean, the kind of sudden shock to the system that China experienced uh, merely from the fact of opening up, right? Because of the deaths that have been caused by the pandemic in China over the last 2 months. So it's difficult to anticipate what is going to happen over the next year. But if all things stay the same, pretty much stay the same, and many of the estimates that the budget, and of course even the economic survey, some of the numbers that in it, the assumptions seem to be conservative or plausible or reasonable. So I see no reason why these numbers are not going to pan out over the next 1 year. And I think that's the most that one can say about a document of this sort, or estimates of this sort at times like this, which is, do these numbers look real? Do these numbers look pragmatic? Do these numbers look realistic? And I would say that they do, and I think Roshan would tend to agree with me.
Just to pick on that external situation point, India is in a slightly more different situation than, say, an economy like China, because exports, while they matter and they're not insignificant, are not the primary driver of our economic growth. And if theoretically, say, the global economy goes into a recession, then whereas we lose in terms of export earnings, we would actually gain in terms of, say, a crash in crude oil prices, crash in commodities. So, the economic survey actually pointed this out, that, the global headwinds sort of come with an inbuilt tailwind for the Indian economy also, because lower prices mean a lower inflation, lower prices mean a lower pressure on the fisc and all those kind of things. For example, fertilizers and all become expensive when petroleum prices go up. So, the real driver of the Indian economy, at least in the immediate term, is more domestic than external. So, the real focus, as far as any economic revival or macroeconomic plan is concerned, always has to be, external. Of course, it doesn't mean that, rapid shocks such as, say, a Ukraine war or something do not impact us. But I have a feeling that the global factors will only matter so much as far as the Indian economy is concerned. And the major driver, of the success or failure of the budget, are more likely to be domestic in nature.
Right. So ample tailwinds despite the global headwinds. Thank you so much, Roshan, and thank you, Sukumar, for giving us your time. Thank you, viewers,
Thank
for
you.
watching this broadcast. Our panelists are very busy today. They do have to bring out a paper for you tomorrow. So we will, come back to you with more updates. Thank you, both of you, for joining us for this broadcast.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.